지구가 살아야 스타트업도 산다. 그 세 번째 이야기, Why Returning to Space라는 주제로 박시수 스페이스뉴스 한국특파원, 신동윤 페리지에어로스페이스 대표, 크리스탈 아zelton SWF 디렉터 세 분을 모시고 함께 패널 토크를 진행해 보겠습니다. 그럼 세 분 무대 위로 올라와 주세요. 네, 귀한 시간 내주셔서 감사합니다. 박시수 스페이스뉴스 한국특파원님께 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. My name is Park Sissoo, a Space News reporter and Seoul-based correspondent for Space News. I'm here attending in the capacity of a journalist, but I'm also running my own. I have my own space startup. It's Space Later. It's space industry intelligence provider. I'm also my company's official research partner of STEPI. It's a state-funded research institute here in South Korea. So I hope that the next year I will get invited to this event as an entrepreneur of a space startup. Okay, let's get started with the introduction. Let me give you just a few seconds just to introduce yourself and the company you work at, the task you do.
So, can I start? Okay. Hello, guys. My name is Dong-Yoon Shin. I'm the founder and the CEO of Perigee Aerospace. Perigee is actually a company that is aiming to develop a very small launch vehicle and launch here in Korea to carry small satellites into orbit. So we're actually 5 years old right now, and we are currently planning to test fly our launch vehicle probably next year in Jeju Island. So I'm very pleased to be here to share some opinions and ideas and thoughts about space. So well, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm Krystal Azelton, and I work for an organization called Secure World Foundation, and we are a nonprofit that promotes space sustainability, which essentially means environmentalism for space. As we see this huge growth in commercial companies, as we see governments doing more and more around the world in space, we want to make sure that that behavior and those activities are responsible and, most importantly, sustainable. It's so exciting to see all of these new technologies and these startups being successful, but it's a very fragile environment. And so my organization is looking at how can we promote industry while at the same time making sure that we all have access to space in the long term. And yes, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been very interesting so far learning about the Korean startup industry this morning.
Yeah, the main theme we are going to talk about this today is about why returning to space. But before talking about this, let me give you a quick question to Mr. Shin. I recently read a news story about the MOU you signed with the Philippine Space Agency, under which Philippine Space Agency will restore the first stage booster of your rocket you are going to launch from Jeju Island in perhaps in next year or the 2024. And I remember that the way of recovering the first stage booster is the first stage booster is coming down from the sky, hanging under the parachute, and my impression was it's quite similar way the rocket wrap is doing to recover its first stage booster. Can you explain? Is this the step in the direction of developing partially reusable rocket?
Well, thank you for the good question. Actually, it is related to what Krystal said. So we are trying to develop a small rocket that is small enough but still capable enough to place around 150 kilograms into sun-synchronous orbit. And we want to make this rocket as reusable as possible. And previous rockets, they hugely rely on the performance of the upper stage. So the way the current generation rockets do is that they actually, the upper stage supplies about 60% of the orbital energy. But we want to make the first stage to supply more energy than usual. and there are two reasons for that. First is that we want to maximize the part that is being reused and throw out the smallest upper stage possible, so that it is easier to be deorbited. And also, Korea, the territorial water of Korea is surrounded by Japan, like China, and many other countries in the southern like direction. So we want to drop off the first stage to the safest location possible. So that's why the first stage is really big and travels around 2,600 kilometers downrange until it lands on the ship. And we are actually considering both options. One is the drone ship landing, and the second one is helicopter recovery. That is partially because this rocket is very small, and it is often really difficult for engineers to reduce, to decrease the size of all the parts that is going into the vehicle. So, for instance, there are communication hardwares, IMUs, GPS. Those components, even if you make the rocket small, they don't just scale down proportionally. So, we want to. So there's much less like mass margin that you can use for landing and re-entry burns. So that's why we are considering parachute recovery as well. But that is one of the options. So we'll be testing landing burns and re-entry burns over and over, and we'll update the progress quite frequently about that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It was not the main topic we are supposed to talk about today. Let's get back to the point. It's a question for both of you. Going to space costs a lot of money, and it's also risk and and also lots of uncertainty for business. And nevertheless, the new space business boom show no sign of landing up. And why you think is such a boom continue to exist despite such a very challenging, including economic downturn and stuff like that? Why going space is so important, and why the industry continue to flourish?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a key question that we all face, right? Like many of us who are space enthusiasts, we think this is just really exciting and fun and cool no matter what. But we are spending a lot of money, both government money and private investment, changing how we do all of it, from scientific research to exploration to satellites. And so for me, the real why is about what benefit we receive on Earth. It's great to do these things for curiosity and interest and excitement, but the reality is we receive so many benefits here on Earth. Benefits that are often misunderstood or not well understood by the public and even by policymakers and others. We wouldn't know about climate change if we didn't have satellites. We wouldn't have, position, navigation, and timing, the little blue dot on your phone when you're using the various Google and Maps and other maps. We understand wildfires and illegal fishing and all of these things, and that all comes from satellite imagery and other satellite systems. Exploration has the same kind of benefits. The crossover technologies actually underpin many of the technologies we use here on Earth. And so I think it's actually really key for anyone who's interested in studying or working in this industry to actually understand how to tell that story, because there is a lot of pushback. There's a lot of concern around the world about climate change and other global problems. And so we have to be, as an industry, positioned to explain why what we're doing matters and why it's worth the investment. And it's not always going to be obvious immediately, but in the long term, these benefits really do provide, a huge variety of value for everyone across the globe. And as startups think about this, you have to be able to tell that story as well. You might find your data or your item or even your rocket the coolest thing that's ever existed, but the vast majority of people, they might be interested for a while because space is popular. But you actually have to be able to explain what you're going to be able to do with a smaller rocket, or how we're able to use new types of remote sensing data to better understand, illegal wildlife tracking, or whatever it is that your data is particularly valuable for, even if it's as simple as, increased access to weather data. That's huge. So I would say that the investment is worth it, but we absolutely have to be thinking about why.
What do you think about that?
Well, actually, as an enthusiast, I would say it is. I think it is one of the most difficult questions for me to answer. But I actually tend to think in two ways. So, as Krystal mentioned, it is really important for us to understand Earth from wider perspective. That can be part of the reasons. And the second thing is, I think we can physically think the resource on Earth is limited, and there's no way for us to stop it. And no matter like how efficient that we could be, no matter how many how many percentage of resource that we can efficiently just restore and reuse, there will be a certain end in sometimes. Earth is finite, and the population is growing, and there's no way for us to stop that. So I think that is the reason why we have to be able to depart Earth a certain time, and that has to be now because we don't know when that kind of crisis will happen. And that is I think the first reason. And the second thing is I think the reason is the same for why we are enjoying sports, why we are enjoying traveling to different countries that you've never been before. Because you want to try. I think it is the fundamental nature for people to pursue new things, accept new challenges, and new problems that didn't even exist before. So I think life is not about surviving. I think life is about accepting new challenges, even discovering the areas to challenge. Because I think that is just simply because of human nature.
Okay, great. Thank you for the answer. This is another question for both of you. First to Mr. Shin, you established a rocket company back in 2018, and you are still young, and then you were much younger. But what drove you to join the space industry, particularly the space rocket industry?
Well, actually, I graduated university just this year, so good for me. It took me like 5 years just to graduate university, but I always wanted to challenge myself building complex machineries, complex parts. So I always enjoyed time building some stuffs. But as far as I can remember, I always wanted to. I always like to just take out my telescope and gaze up the stars. And one day I wanted to contribute to the world that maybe we can build the rocket. So to me, when I started like dreaming about going to space, there's no other option in Korea for me to do that because there was an astronaut program, but I really hope that program would last longer, and someday I could be one to go up to orbit, but such opportunity didn't last that long. So I always tend to think that if there's no opportunity in the market, I should be the one to make one. So that's why I started building rockets. I started building the small sounding rockets, solid rockets that would go up to 15 kilometers when I was in middle school. And then I continued scaling up the rocket. In the first place, I didn't want to like. I never thought of like founding a company. I just wanted to make an organization that can sustainably build and test and fly the rockets. And for me, the only option for making a sustainable organization was to build a company that can earn profit from it. And sustainably just make rockets. So honestly, I never thought that seriously until it became serious. Yeah.
Okay, what about the Krystal? The organization you work at is non-profit, right? And it deal with very important issue. This sustainable use of our space, but it's hard to say. It's a kind of we don't hardly. In the past, we didn't even consider it a kind of business in space industry. Why drove you to join this particular segment?
So I have to confess, I also wanted to be an astronaut. but it was also not practical. Despite having a space program, the path to becoming an astronaut is still very small. So I too am excited about the day when that is no longer quite such a small group of people. But in my case, I took a different path. So I'm interested in policy. I'm interested in what governments do. I'm interested in how we manage industry and other activities. And so that's what I pursued for a long time. And then at some point I realized, oh, I can do space and policy. And so kind of circled back around to doing that, which I think is a really exciting opportunity. I always tell young people that it's wonderful to be an engineer or a scientist if those things are your passion. But I'm passionate about what those things can do for society. I don't necessarily enjoy running the experiment myself, but I'm incredibly interested in the outcomes of what other people are doing. And so for me, I really like to talk to others about how there's so many different things. You can be a lawyer and work in the space industry. You can be a marketing or communication specialist and work in the space industry. So you can combine more than one passion. And that's really what led me to this, was doing work in space, which I find really interesting and fascinating, but doing it in a place where my skill set in communicating and writing and talking and understanding policy was more useful.
Okay, let's keep asking about the question to Kirsten, because you said that the sustainable use of outer space is quite a political issue, but I think it's an emerging issue, and so I think it's possibly there will be some good business opportunity in that segment. Could you explain what kind of business are out there in relation to secure and sustainable use of outer space, and what are start explaining what
Absolutely.
are business opportunities out there? Yeah.
There's a ton of happening in this area. If you told me 5 or 10 years ago that there would be a growing industry, not just in satellites, but in sustainable satellite operations, I would have been very surprised. And yet that's exactly what we have right now. So a good example is the company Astroscale, which is based out of Japan. And they have offices in numerous other countries, but they're based primarily in Japan. And they're developing and have developed technology that's going to go up and remove debris from orbit, both debris that's legacy, so it's already up there, it's causing dangers, it's a problem, but they're also working with industry to think about, so if a company launches a satellite constellation and one of those satellites doesn't work, and let's say they don't have enough fuel, or they aren't able to deorbit it themselves, or they don't want to put that on their satellite, they'd rather pay a company to go up and get it for them so that they can follow the rules. They're also working with governments to look at various capabilities. So it's an incredibly exciting area. So debris removal is one. On-orbit servicing is another area of satellites that is really coming along quickly. So the idea that sometimes satellites run out of fuel, and maybe we, rather than letting them be dead or moving them to an orbit or letting them decay, we might actually be able to reuse them. There's also really exciting developments in manufacturing, in recycling materials. There's a lot of material up in space that's just sitting there and nobody's using it or doing anything with it. So companies are looking at what can we do with it? Basically, how can we recycle things in space? So, I mean, there's all these, and these are all incredibly new technologies that are coming along really, really quickly. And yes, the business cases are complicated. It's not perfectly well understood, but that's what makes being in a startup environment exciting, is that you get to develop that. And with space, so many of the government customers are government. So I think most of these companies are looking at both government customers as well as other commercial customers to develop their businesses.
You said that there are some various in-orbit services, including space debris removal. But what do you think is the services that will be monetized in the near term?
So I think they will be monetizing debris removal. There's several companies that are developing these technologies. Some are more fantastical than others, but there's quite strong indication that the technology is going to work. There's several demonstration missions that are lined up to launch in the very near future. I think it's going to be a combination of working with governments to remove legacy debris. There's some very dangerous rocket bodies up there. There's satellites that aren't able to get to an orbit where they'll decay naturally. I also think they'll be working with other companies. So there's, as many probably know, there are a few very large constellations that are being launched in order to create new internet capabilities around the world. When you launch that many satellites, some of them are just not going to work. And so I think there's a business case there as they work with other commercial industry to say, okay, well, if your satellite's not working, we're going to go get that. It's going to be a mix. some of that still has to be proven out for sure, but there are definitely customers who are interested in. The funding has come through. Several of these companies, ClearSpace based out of Europe and Astroscale, have done really well so far. And I think the technology appears to be working, so I'm very hopeful.
You mentioned this Astroscale. Actually, it's quite famous globally in the segment. Could you tell other company you are paying close attention to for its business potential?
Sure. So I think those are particularly interesting. I think, as I mentioned, the in-orbit servicing. One company I really like is Orbit Fab. They call themselves gas stations in space. They're growing really, really, really rapidly. I would also just point you to certain space clusters, which I think is, if you're interested in learning about some of these new companies, they tend to congregate together. So the Harwell campus in the UK has a number of really exciting, innovative companies. Japan is host to a number of really interesting companies, as is the Colorado and California space clusters. So I would also just say, looking at all of those companies there and seeing what they're doing is always really interesting.
Is there any Asian countries engaging in that segment?
Yeah, absolutely. So Japan, I would say, is a huge leader in this area. Korea, we see companies developing. Australia, New Zealand. These are absolutely areas of interest.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a question to Mr. Shin. A small rocket maker, you know this, it all face multiple challenges. I heard that to the bottom line. For example, the challenge they face is inflation for sure, and investment crunch as a consequence, and ever intensifying competition with the bigger rocket, particularly because the big rocket is getting bigger, and many are trying to get reusable. And tell me about the challenge your company faced, and how you are going to overcome this kind of multiple challenges you face.
Well, actually, that is a really good question. And sure, there's inflation happening. We actually lost like 2 contracts recently from satellite manufacturers. So we've been working with a lot of satellite companies for our maiden flights in 2024, 2025. And we actually had some multiple talks with satellite companies, but their situation became like really difficult in recent days. So yeah, definitely we see those kind of things happening in the entire space industry. And for us, although there's a lot of rocket developers in around the world, we still have a very few rocket developers that succeeded in launching those rockets continuously. So I know there's Rocket Lab that is doing really well, and SpaceX that is keep lowering the cost of single rocket launch. And there's Astra. Astra has been developing the rocket at very low cost. I think that is one of the right ways to do it. But their rocket had some technical issues, though they're building one from scratch again. So yeah, there's a lot of companies that declare that they're going to build and launch those small rockets. But there's only a few rocket startup that manages to build one and launch one reliably. So I think there's still a room for it. And one of the markets that I'm focusing on is the national defense. So there's a lot of needs and demands for Korean governments to build satellites within 100 to 200 kilogram range and launch. I know that there's already a plan, a specific plan to launch 150 kilogram satellites, 150 of them each year to build and maintain that constellation. So I think there's domestically, I think there's a strong market demand for launching those small satellites. And internationally, we do have some commercial entities that are actually already signed up to launch on our maiden flights. Actually, the first one is free, but yeah. So the demand, I think, it is getting more competitive, but I think it's still there. And I think that the time for us to catch up, I think it is going to be around like 2-3 years. We do have, and I think, and the biggest challenge in Korean market specifically is that to find the people to work with. So I think one of the biggest issues in space industry that is underestimated is hiring. So we see a lot of demands still, but we see like less and less people that are willing to come to space industry and work for it, because I don't think there's like strong strong promotion or education that is helping people to focus on this industry and come for the work. So yeah.
Well, I can also comment a little bit on the investment angle. So we're definitely seeing a shift in investment in space startups. So previously, you mostly saw VC companies looking for unicorns and a quick return on investment. You do see a lot of investment from governments around the world, and that is, I would actually say, increasing to a certain extent. We're seeing a decline in VC funding and a shift towards more traditional funding. I'll say something that's a little controversial, which is if you're looking to be a unicorn, I don't think the space business is for you. There are a few examples, and congratulations to those companies, but as someone who is an enthusiast, I think this is a business where there are many, many opportunities, places for great startups to make strong business cases and to do really exciting things. But this is exquisite hardware. It's not software. It's not simple, and the startup costs are not low. So it's not a place to enter into a market, make something really quickly, get it up, and then move on. That's just not an appropriate approach for the space industry. It happens, but it's not the best. And we're seeing the same with some of the startups that have now moved to SPACs. It's complex what we're seeing, right? And so I would always suggest for startup companies, do you know what you're trying to do? How is it new? What is it different? But also, how do you intend to sell it? We have a tendency in many industries, but especially in the space industry, to think of build it and they will come. If I put out some really interesting data, if I put out some really cool stuff, then people are just going to magically show up. And that's true to a certain extent. But the reality is space data is valuable in so many industries that don't use it. And so if you want to be a successful startup, you have to think about where your funding is going to come from. It's probably going to have to be diverse. And when you're ready to move to the actual client selling stage, you need to be thinking about how you're actually communicating, because you will be educating your clients as much as you will be selling them something. And I think that is a really important consideration for startups in the space industry, to have a plan for how you're going to grow your client base, rather than just assume that if you put out a good product, you will magically create customers.
You just mentioned that it's selling, how to sell your product or service is important. But there's a unique thing to this space industry. There are regulatory issues in terms of selling the product to somewhere. The U.S. is for sure the biggest space market in the world, but to sell the product is quite challenging, because there's a regulatory barrier, and there's a lot of complex process to get through to sell, to get approval to sell the product. So it's quite the challenging. So Mr. Shin, about this issue, any challenges you face to sell your product to a market beyond Korea? Any challenges you have experienced?
Well, yeah, sure. So we haven't actually signed any contracts with U.S. companies, but it is really difficult for us to go to U.S. market. Of course, there are many regulatory barriers that is making us difficult to go for that market. So that's why we are focusing on mostly our market comes from new developing countries. So I think one of the biggest market in satellite launches, especially for small satellite launches, is the sales demand for developing countries. So we've signed MOU with the Philippines government, and I know there's a very strong demand in Philippines and other neighboring countries to build and launch their own small satellites, because small satellites are not only good for startups, but it is actually a very good choice for those developing countries to start their own space programs. So I think that is also a good demand that we can consider, and the market barrier for those countries are relatively low, and it is really easy for Korean startups to approach and do the sales. Yeah.
Could you specify the Asian countries or developed countries that are relatively favorable to Korean companies?
So I would say Philippines is definitely one of the best candidates that you can consider. And there's Malaysian satellite. That was actually the first customer of Falcon launch vehicle. So so we haven't actually talked to any companies within Malaysia, but Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam as well. We are talking with like 3 Vietnamese companies that are building 6U satellites. So yeah, there's a lot of companies. Mostly, those companies are government funded, and they're working really hard to build their own satellite constellations for communications as well, because their territory, their land is divided into many pieces. So it is really hard for them to build communication line on land. So that's why they're adopting like services like Starlink and Amazon Kuiper. So they are really working hard to bring those services in to start internet services. And at the same time, they're trying to build those kind of services by their own. So I think there's a really good opportunity there.
Okay. This is another question to Mr. Shin. You just explained the difficulty you face, and sometimes, and I think that the difficulty is sometimes a driver of innovation that bring fresh new opportunity. And did you see any new opportunity emerging because of the ongoing economic downturn?
Yeah. Not particularly because of the economic crisis these days, but there's increasing demand within Korea as well to move forward to more cleaner fuel. So that is kind of like a regulatory movement. But we started off as building methane rocket engines, and we initially started to develop like reusable stages, and decided to make the first stage big and second stage as small as possible. And we are actually selling those technologies as well separately to Korean government. So those regulatory demands and our actions to overcome those regulations eventually helped us finding those new markets that are like technology sales to the government and military. I think those are also the good markets that appeared quite recently.
I think the cleaner fuel will be the one issue you there's something to talk about.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's a lot of interest in that. You mentioned the economic downturn, and I think it's been both a positive and a negative for the industry, just like COVID. I mean, in some ways, the space industry was fairly insulated from a lot of the problems, especially once we got past the first few months. We've seen a growth and an interest in the data that satellites produce. That said, anytime you have an economic downturn, you're going to see retrenchment. So yes, just like in any industry, some satellite companies are not going to succeed, or they're going to get sold off for parts. But I would say there are a lot of opportunities in the downstream market as well. So a lot of clients want products. They don't want data. It really depends on the exact situation. And so we're definitely seeing a growth in that part of we're seeing growth in a lot of places, but we're definitely seeing a lot of new interest in not just actually building and launching your own satellite, but being the middleman between the data that comes from them and the actual clients and end users who need the final decision or the final piece of information. So I think we're seeing both. Yes, there's going to be some failure based on this, but there is also a stronger interest in this as a way of cutting costs for other industries. Satellite data can be really valuable in making better strategic decisions, a better understanding landscape and environment. And so that, I think, is a place where you'll see an increased interest right now because other businesses are struggling. This can potentially be a way of actually reducing their costs.
That will be another innovation that caused by this economic downturn. We have just 5 minutes. It's about 6 minutes left. And any question if you have it in the floor, just raise your hand. Otherwise, we will keep talking about some question left. This is one question for Mr. Shin, and this is another one is for Krystal. Krystal, could you explain the latest market trend you observe in the U.S. in space industry, and what are the new business opportunity you think is newly emerging in the U.S. market?
Sure. So we talked a little bit about this. I mean, I do think the downstream market, like I said, is becoming really quickly growing. We're also seeing alternatives to different types of remote sensing. So, SAR technology is really becoming a big deal right now. I would also say that in general, the market's changing because we are seeing changes in the regulatory situation. So yes, the United States in particular has been infamous for having a lot of restrictions. And guess what? Other countries didn't have those restrictions, and companies started, when these interest in new startups, they started going other places. So I think the US government has really caught up on that and is really working to streamline that procedure and make it so that remote sensing companies can be successful both in terms of setting up in the United States, but then also in selling to the United States. And so there's a lot of opportunities there in the sense that those barriers that did exist have generally been significantly reduced. We're also seeing a lot of interest in services that used to be exclusively government. So we're seeing a trend towards things like, for instance, commercial weather data is a really good example. Now, no one's saying that we're going to get rid of all of the government-driven weather data. That's not going to happen. It's an essential service. But we are seeing room for supplementary data, for interest in that area. Another area where we're seeing growth is space situational awareness data. Again, something that governments have traditionally tracked and monitored on their own and even provided that data for free. We're seeing supplementary services being built on that. Additional sensors, additional monitoring, trying to understand the space environment much better. Another area that we're seeing, I think we're going to see a development of commercial PNT services, particularly in the low Earth orbit. So most of those satellites are in a geostationary orbit. They're not in the same orbits, but there is a lot of interest in whether we could supplement or create cheaper, easier services in low Earth orbit. So I think those are some of the trends that we're seeing areas for growth. You're not going to see a lot of new startups who are taking pictures of Earth. Like Planet's kind of got that captured in the startup market at this point. I mean, there are some, don't get me wrong. I think it's the newer areas, the innovative areas, the places where we're building on government data where we're going to continue to see a lot of fast-paced growth.
On a quick question to Krystal, the election was over in the U.S. and it's known that the political landscape of the U.S. is likely to change a little bit because of the kind of a result of the election. Do you think any changes in the course of space policy or any kind of challenges possible in the industry of the United States?
Yeah, so in one way, we're kind of lucky. Space is not what we call it is a bipartisan issue in the United States. So it's not as bad as some industries that when the United States government changes, everything changes. Space is something where the two different parties do agree with each other to a certain extent. What we do see is more deadlock over budget. So if we end up with a split Congress, which seems very likely, I think what you're going to see is U.S. funding will get a lot more contentious. What we actually pay for, what goes into the United States congressional justification, which is our budget. I think that's going to change. The general direction of regulatory change, so support for commercial industry, that's not going to change. Both, the previous administration, this administration, the next administration, they're all going to support that. That is not going away. I think what it actually looks like, who's in charge of certain things. So a lot of the details that frankly don't matter to most people unless that's actually what you're doing. But overall, we've been fairly good. The other thing I will say is the tone of engagement is going to change. So under a Democratic Party, you're going to see a lot of support for, say, climate change initiatives and efforts to monitor the Earth using satellites for those purposes. Other administrations are going to talk about that very differently.
Okay, we have just 1 minute left, and this final question is for Mr. Shin. There will be maybe some young or people who are interested in space are considering doing some business in the space sector. Could you give them kind of both encouragement and inspiration of why doing business in space is valuable and why they need to try harder?
Well, as I said, I think our DNA, like deep inside our DNA, there's a willingness to go out and do the exploration. I think that is the fundamental reason for us to do new business, not only just space, but doing new businesses. And like within Korean society, I feel like a lot of people just spend too much time on optimizing their choices. So rather than like pursuing really hard to make the results successful, but rather they spend too much time on just making the choices. So I think that kind of, I think those are the biggest, probably the biggest challenges that our startup society is also facing. So a lot of people tend to go for the job that is at lower risk, lower risks, and some good social, I would say, social, how can I say? Yeah, social values and stuffs. But I think we should focus more on our inner thoughts on like what do you really want to do, and I think this society has like enough opportunities for us to pursue the things that we really want to do rather than like those optimal choices. So I think that is the word that I wanted to make. Yeah.
Okay, time is up. Thank you for everybody for listening to our conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.